Rome had crushed its enemies, conquered continents, and bent the ancient world to its will. But nothing prepared its emperor for the moment he learned that the greatest threat to his authority wasn't an army or a rival, it was his own daughter. What followed exposed how far power would go to protect itself. Chapter 1. Rome at the height of power. By the late 1st century BCE and early 1st century CE, Rome stood unmatched. Its legions controlled territory stretching from the Atlantic coast of Hispania to the deserts of Syria, from the northern frontiers of Germania to the fertile Nile Valley. This was not only a military empire but a political and cultural system built on authority, tradition, and control. After years of civil war, Augustus had transformed Rome into a principate, centralizing power in one ruler while maintaining the outward forms of the old republic. The emperor's authority rested on more than force. He was expected to embody Roman values: discipline, self-restraint, loyalty to family, and moral order. These expectations were reinforced through legislation. Under Augustus, laws regulating marriage, adultery, and childbirth among the elite turned private behavior into a matter of public concern. Moral conduct was no longer simply personal, it was political. At the center of this system stood the imperial household. The emperor's wife was not merely a private partner but a public figure whose conduct symbolized stability and legitimacy. Her actions reflected directly on the ruler himself. Any perceived failure of virtue within the palace could be interpreted as a failure of leadership. Rome was also a society driven by observation and rumor. Slaves, courtiers, rivals, and informers moved information rapidly through the city. The imperial family lived under constant scrutiny, and secrecy was difficult to maintain. In such an environment, personal scandals could not remain contained. When private behavior conflicted with public ideals, the result was not gossip alone, it was a potential crisis of authority for the Roman state itself. Chapter 2. The woman behind the crown. The woman at the center of this story was Julia the Elder, the only biological child of Emperor Augustus. Born in 39 BCE, Julia was raised not as a private citizen, but as a political asset of the new imperial order. From an early age, her life was shaped by dynastic necessity rather than personal choice. Augustus controlled her marriages carefully, first to Marcellus, then to Marcus Agrippa, and finally to Tiberius, each union designed to secure succession and loyalty. Within the ruling elite, Julia was highly educated by Roman standards. Ancient sources describe her as intelligent, articulate, and socially adept, trained in literature and rhetoric suitable for Rome's highest circles. Yet her position was tightly constrained. Despite her status, she possessed no formal political authority. Her influence existed indirectly, through family ties, public visibility, and the symbolic role she played. As the emperor's daughter, Roman society expected elite women to embody pudicitia, sexual modesty and moral discipline, especially those connected to the ruling house. These expectations intensified after Augustus introduced moral legislation aimed at restoring traditional Roman values. Julia was not merely subject to these laws, she was meant to represent their success. Yet ancient historians, including Tacitus and Suetonius, portray a different reality. They describe Julia as resistant to the rigid moral framework imposed upon her, living in sharp contrast to the image Augustus promoted. Whether these accounts were exaggerated by later hostility remains debated. But even contemporaries recognized that Julia's public role and private behavior were on a collision course. As the emperor's daughter and symbolic model of virtue, she occupied a position where deviation, real or alleged, could not remain a personal matter for long. Chapter 3. The affair that number one was supposed to know. By the final years of the 1st century BCE, rumors surrounding Julia's private life begun to circulate within Rome's elite circles. According to ancient sources, including Velleius Paterculus and later Suetonius, Julia was accused of multiple adulterous relationships involving men of high status. These were not anonymous or marginal figures, but senators and aristocrats, individuals whose proximity to power transformed personal misconduct into a political threat. Among those named was Iulus Antonius, the son of Mark Antony and Fulvia, his inclusion carried particular weight. As a former consul and member of Rome's old aristocracy, Iulus' rival lineage that Augustus had defeated but never fully erased. Any intimate connection between Julia and such a figure risked being interpreted as something more than adultery, possibly a challenge to imperial authority itself. Rome was a city where privacy was fragile. The households of the elite were filled with slaves, freedmen, and clients, all of whom observed and transmitted information. Social gatherings, banquets, and public festivals created constant opportunities for rumor to spread. In this environment, secrecy was almost impossible to sustain, especially for someone as visible as the emperor's daughter. Roman law already condemned adultery, but under Augustus it carried new significance. Sexual misconduct by elite women was no longer only a moral failing, it could be prosecuted as a public crime. In Julia's case, the accusations blurred the boundary between personal behavior and political subversion. What may have begun as private relationships now appeared, in the eyes of the state, as a violation of both law and imperial order. The affair, or series of affairs, had become something Rome could no longer ignore. Chapter 4. Discovery. When rumor became reality by 2 BCE, the rumors surrounding Julia had reached a point where they could no longer be dismissed as idle talk. Rome's political culture ensured that information flowed upward. Senators, informers, and members of the imperial household all played roles in transmitting accusations, especially when those accusations carried political implications. What began as whispered scandal became a matter of state concern. Ancient sources do not agree on exactly how Augustus learned of Julius' alleged conduct, but they are consistent. On one point, the evidence was considered substantial. Suetonius records that Augustus was initially unwilling to believe the accusations, a reaction consistent with both paternal attachment and political caution. However, the number of implicated men, their social rank, and the persistence of reports made denial increasingly impossible. The involvement of Iulus Antonius proved especially dangerous. As the son of Mark Antony, he embodied a defeated but still symbolically potent rival to the Augustan regime. His presence transformed Julius' alleged adultery into something that could be interpreted as political conspiracy. In Rome, intimacy with imperial women had long been associated with ambitions for power, whether real or imagined. Public awareness grew quickly, while formal confirmation remained confined to the emperor and his advisors. Rome's population thrived on speculation. The gap between rumor and official action created tension, both within the palace and across the city. For Augustus, the crisis was no longer merely personal. Ignoring the accusations would undermine the very moral legislation he had imposed on Rome. Acting on them, however, meant exposing his own household to public disgrace. The emperor was forced into a position where silence itself became a political liability. Chapter 5. Judgment of an empire. Once the accusations against Julia could no longer be contained, Augustus faced a decision that no Roman emperor before him had confronted so publicly. As ruler, he had positioned himself as the restorer of traditional morality. As a father, he was confronting the alleged crimes of his own child. Roman law offered no exemption for family ties, especially under the moral reforms Augustus himself had enacted. In 18 BCE, Augustus had introduced the Lex Julia de Adulteris Coercandis, which defined adultery as a public crime punishable by exile and confiscation of property. These laws were designed to regulate elite behavior and strengthen family structures, but they also bound the emperor to his own standards. To ignore Julius' case would have exposed the moral legislation as selective and hollow. Augustus chose to proceed as ruler rather than father. The accusations were formally treated as criminal violations of Roman law. Julia was charged with adultery, and the men involved were investigated individually. Iulus Antonius was condemned to death, forced to take his own life, a punishment that reflected not only moral violation but perceived political danger. Other accused lovers were exiled or punished according to their rank. Julia's sentence was severe. She was banished to the small, desolate island of Pandateria, off the coast of Campania. She was stripped of her wealth, forbidden from drinking wine, and denied the company of men. Even her mother, Scribonia, was only allowed to accompany her after requesting permission. Augustus reportedly refused to see his daughter again. The judgment sent a clear message across Rome. Imperial authority was not restrained by blood. Moral law would be enforced, even at the highest level. Yet this act of severity also revealed the cost of absolute power, the transformation of family tragedy into public spectacle. The emperor had upheld the law, but at the price of exposing the empire's most intimate fracture. Chapter 6. Punishment that shocked Rome. Julius. Punishment reverberated far beyond the imperial household. Exile had long been a Roman penalty, but its application to the emperor's own daughter was unprecedented in both scale and symbolism. Pandateria, modern Ventotene, was a barren island used specifically for isolating politically sensitive offenders. Sending Julia there was not merely a legal sentence, it was a public demonstration of imperial resolve. Ancient writers emphasize the harshness of the conditions imposed on her. According to Suetonius, Augustus forbade her from consuming wine, limited her diet, and restricted her contact with others. These measures were intended to reinforce the moral character of the punishment, transforming exile into a visible act of discipline. Julia's children were removed from her care, severing her remaining ties to power and influence. Rome reacted with a mixture of shock and grim acknowledgement. For some, the punishment confirmed Augustus' commitment to moral reform. For others, it exposed the severity and cruelty of a system that placed ideology above family. The Senate, carefully aligned with the emperor, offered no resistance. Public dissent, if it existed, remained unrecorded. The punishment also functioned as political theater. By enforcing the law against his own bloodline, Augustus reinforced the idea that no one stood above the imperial moral order. At the same time, it served as a warning to Rome's elite. Proximity to power offered no protection from disgrace. Yet the spectacle carried unintended consequences. The moral authority Augustus sought to protect now appeared inseparable from fear. The punishment shocked Rome not only because of who suffered it, but because it revealed how far imperial power could reach, into the most private corners of life, and without mercy. Chapter 7. Aftermath, Power, Fear, and Consequences. The removal of Julia did not end the crisis, it reshaped the internal dynamics of the Roman state. With her exile, Augustus eliminated a symbolic liability, but the shock of the event lingered within the imperial family and the political elite. Trust within the court narrowed. Association, kinship, and even past friendships were now potential risks, as proximity to scandal could invite suspicion. The consequences extended to succession politics. Julia had been central to Augustus' dynastic plans. Through her marriages, she had produced heirs meant to stabilize the regime. Her disgrace forced Augustus to distance himself from several potential successors and recalibrate the future of the Principate. This instability contributed to the eventual rise of Tiberius, a ruler whose relationship with Augustus had long been strained and whose reign would later be marked by paranoia and repression. The scandal also intensified Augustus' moral campaign. Laws regulating marriage and adultery were enforced with renewed severity, and moral rhetoric became more prominent in imperial propaganda. Rather than retreating from his reforms, Augustus doubled down, framing Julia's punishment as proof of the law's impartiality. Yet this rigidity bred fear rather than moral renewal. Senators and aristocrats became more cautious, less open, and more guarded in their personal lives. Publicly, Augustus' image remained intact, even strengthened in some accounts. Privately, ancient sources suggest a man deeply affected by the episode. Suetonius notes that he avoided mentioning Julia's name and expressed regret, though never reversing her sentence. Stability was preserved, but at a cost. Rome emerged from the scandal outwardly disciplined but inwardly tense. The imperial system had proven it could survive personal catastrophe, but it also revealed how easily power could convert private failure into collective anxiety. The empire was stable, yet increasingly governed by fear rather than consensus. Chapter 8. Legacy, Love, Power, and Control in Rome. Julia's fall did not end with her exile. She remained on Pandateria for years before being transferred to Rhegium, on the Italian mainland, where she lived under continued restriction until her death in 14 CE, the same year Augustus himself died. She was never formally pardoned. Even in death, she was denied burial in the imperial mausoleum, a final confirmation that her disgrace had become permanent policy. Later Roman historians struggled to interpret her story. Tacitus approached the episode with restraint, emphasizing its political implications rather than moral judgment. Suetonius presented Julia as a symbol of moral failure, though his work reflects the biases of a later imperial culture. Cassius Dio viewed the affair through the lens of power, suggesting that sexual scandal and political threat were inseparable in Rome's ruling class. Modern historians remain divided, questioning how much of Julia's reputation was shaped by propaganda rather than proven fact. The episode exposes the limited space available to women connected to power. Julia possessed status, education, and visibility, yet none of these translated into autonomy. Her body and behavior became instruments of imperial ideology. Whether her actions were transgressive or merely nonconforming, the response revealed that elite women could be punished not only for what they did, but for what they symbolized. More broadly, the scandal highlights a central contradiction of Roman imperial rule. The emperor demanded moral perfection while wielding absolute authority. Personal desire, when it conflicted with public control, was treated as a political threat. Julia's story endures because it illustrates how power in Rome extended beyond armies and laws, into family, sexuality, and memory itself. Closing reflection. When private lives became public law. The story of Julia the Elder is not an isolated scandal but a window into how power functioned at the highest level of the Roman Empire. Augustus did not simply punish a daughter, he enforced an ideology. By turning private behavior into public law, the Principate blurred the boundary between governance and personal life in ways that would define imperial rule for centuries. This episode also reveals the limits of moral reform imposed from above. Augustus sought to restore traditional values through legislation and example, yet the severity of Julia's punishment exposed the rigidity and fragility of that system. The law succeeded in asserting authority, but it failed to create genuine moral consensus. Instead, it fostered compliance rooted in fear and surveillance. For historians, the case remains difficult precisely because the sources are shaped by power. Julia left no writings of her own. Her reputation survives through male historians writing under later emperors, within a culture that often equated female autonomy with moral danger. What can be stated with certainty is that her downfall served the state more than it served justice. In the end, this Roman scandal endures because it illustrates a recurring pattern in history. When rulers claim moral authority, personal transgression becomes political crime. Julia's life and punishment remind us that empires are not sustained only by conquest and law, but by control over behavior, narrative, and memory. Rome survived the scandal, but it did so by revealing just how much power demanded in return. If you want to understand how power truly works, how empires police loyalty, control morality, and erase their own scandals, stay with us. Subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because history's most revealing stories aren't about wars. They're about what rulers do when the truth hits too close to home.